We recorded our conversation with Erin O'Toole on July 20th. That was a month ago in real time and about a decade in trade development years. Since then, the latest trade talks collapsed, and we found ourselves again the target of punishing tariffs. Now, we could have shelved this episode. But when you listen to what Erin lays out, you'll realize that the conversation is still current. It's the exact blueprint of the structural vulnerabilities that forced the collapse on August 22nd. Erin explicitly warned about the two negotiation tables in Washington, which is exactly where the talks broke down. Erin takes a firm anti-retaliation stance in this episode. Given the developments of this past week, and with the PM now launching dollar-for-dollar retaliation, the arguments may well require a review. Still, understanding his counter-argument isn't academic. It's essential risk management for your balance sheet. Here's our conversation. This is the Tariff Home Companion, a trade podcast, a Canadian trade podcast, where we seek to shed light, not heat, on issues affecting Canada and Canadians. At some point in the course of this discussion, we will be joined by our regular host, the co-host, Stephen de Boer, former ambassador of Canada to the World Trade Organization. But I'm happy to say that I'm joined right now by Erin O'Toole, who has led a distinguished public service and private sector career in Canada. Former leader of Canada's loyal opposition. He is currently in private practice in Toronto, advising clients on a range of security and trade issues. Erin, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Rambod.
It's a pleasure to have you. So before this discussion launched itself, we were chatting about football and about the World Cup, and how we saw yesterday on the one side, we had a disciplined team working together with hundreds of passes, almost flawless between them, playing the long game and the deep game, and very much in control of the game. And then on the other side, that you had a somewhat violent, at times cheating, at times team led by someone who would say an over-the-hill star, disorganized, entitled, and certainly a sore loser to boot at the end. I'm not drawing any parallels, of course. And the only thing to say is that the team with the better hair won. But we are here to talk trade. We're here to talk principally about Canada-US relations, which I think occupies everyone's minds these days. And it's not just the threats of tariffs, the imposition of tariffs since March 1st, 2025, the changing landscape of tariffs and trade between Canada and the United States. But even in the last week or two, we've had additional threats, notably taxing the smoke, as some have said, and of course, the concerns about the bridge. Let's start from the very top. And this is something that I think we can fairly say occupies both sides of the electoral landscape, or multiple sides of the electoral landscape, which is the deal. A deal, some sort of a deal. In the normal course, when we sit down and negotiate a deal with the other side, we look at the competencies of our opponents, or not even opponents, but rather just our partners in negotiations. And we ask ourselves, okay, so what is it that the other side can do? How is it they can do it? And then we negotiate a deal in order to constrain that movement or future movements, in order to create security and predictability for our commercial actors. That essentially is what a treaty is. It's us committing ourselves to a course of action based on our own competencies, and then creating restrictions on the other side based on theirs. So we have certain competencies on the side of the United States that we thought we had. Tariffs and taxes are the province of Congress. And now that calculation has shifted in a way that it seems to me makes it very difficult for anyone to negotiate a deal that will constrain future action. Up to now, we've had, the IEPA tariffs, which were declared illegal, the 122 tariffs, which have lapsed, the 232 tariffs, which are somehow justified under national security, and now the latest is sort of the tax on smoke. How do we negotiate a deal?
You've laid it out very well. How do you negotiate a deal with such a chaotic landscape? Going way back, I think you're right. Starting from the top, the Liberation Day, according to President Trump, is when, for the second time in Trump's time leading the United States, he has upended the rules-based trading order. He started that in his first term, where we saw 232s for the first time. But with Liberation Day, we saw an all hands on deck repudiation of the rules-based system, which people forget in the decades following World War II, essentially established the longest period of relative global peace, but certainly prosperity and bringing people out of poverty in many corners of the world at an unprecedented rate. So while there were certainly some groups and people left behind by globalization, there were problems with it. Throwing out the rules-based order and not replacing it really with anything that gives predictability or fairness has really put the world upside down. So we've had trade disrupted. We've had threats to multilateral organizations and alliances like NATO. The WTO is essentially almost defunct or not operating as an organization. So Canada has to negotiate for a deal amid this. The one lifeline or the one buoy we have that we can hold on to save ourselves from drowning has been CUSMA, the renegotiated NAFTA from the first term of President Trump, which gave most of our economy a degree of certainty and stability. That is, no help to steel, aluminum, and the auto sectors, which are still impacted by the 232s. And then we've been fighting many little trade disputes with the president, as you said at the outset, with the fentanyl tariffs and emergency tariffs, the IEPA tariffs that were struck down. Now they're repositioning that for forced labor, potentially forest fires. You're in this area where we will constantly have to respond to the demands of the U.S. while holding on to CUSMA. And my hope really is the economic damage the tariffs are doing, which in recent days, including on New York Times Daily podcast this morning, reminding Americans that most of the inflationary cost of living crisis that Americans are dealing with, beyond the fuel pressures from the president's war in Iran, have come from tariffs, which are being paid for by consumers, which are putting inflationary pressures into the economy at a time when a lot of the people that voted for President Trump cannot afford to pay the higher prices. So my hope is in the coming months, having sort of thrusted and parried with all of the various chaotic measures of the U.S. administration, we can wrap everything into a deal to provide some certainty on the 232s. We can get into the 232s and my experience from them in the first Trump administration, but if we could even get the 232s on steel, aluminum, and autos down to a single-digit rate to give predictability for the next few years, I think that would be a win, to be honest with you, in the circumstances. But, my vantage point with the Canada-U.S. Economic Council that I sit on is that everyone is trying to support the government's efforts to navigate this chaotic landscape to get a deal that's as strong as possible in the circumstances.
Thanks. And let me also welcome our colleague, Stephen de Boer, who's just joined us. Let me say that this was all my mistake on numerous fronts, but anyway, I'm glad to have you here, Stephen. And you mentioned the Economic Council, and I'll continue and then let you.
Sure.
You mentioned the Economic Council. And I'm finishing up The Mirror and the Light, Hilary Mantel's third installment in the Wolf Hall trilogy. And of course, Henry VIII has a council. And everyone sits around the council. Henry VIII stamps his staff, and there's only one person who really dares say anything, and that's his Chancellor, William Fitzwilliam. I'm again not drawing any parallels with the current situation, but the whole point of the King's Council was to stop him from making errors he would regret later. And the question I have for you is, what exactly does the Advisory Council do?
Well, that's a great setup. None of us council members are risking hanging or anything that Henry VIII might have if he didn't like his council. And my son has been making me watch Game of Thrones recently, which I'm years late getting onto that bandwagon. And we're not the king's hand either. We're not the prime minister's hand. I think there's two elements to the council. There's one that is highly symbolic, that shows politicians of former types, colors, union leaders, sector leaders, CEOs coming together to provide perspective and to row together on the good ship Canada. But the second part of it is a substantive one, and that's why I agreed to sit on it. I did not think Prime Minister Trudeau's council was a serious one, in part because they weren't able to talk about what they did. They weren't able to seek guidance and report to the Canadians on what we were talking about. And I had said to Janice Charette that was very important for me to be able to explain to Canadians, explain to my political party how this council was intended to be nonpartisan and as positive to the Canadian effort as possible. And I have found the substantive side of the council to be very helpful, where some of the business leaders on it that have operations in the US are able to funnel in what they're hearing through their various regulatory encounters with the government, or what employees and other pressures are saying. Having union leaders at the table to be able to bring the latest from the auto sector, for example, to the table, I think is important. And I wanted to really make sure that security was part of the dialogue, which I think we missed that economic security part in the first negotiations with Trump, because while an auto parts industry, integration of which is critical for our economy, can be an auto parts supply chain, it can also be a defense supply chain if it's contributing to the building of ships and to armored vehicles. And so making stronger connections to the security message with the Americans was key. So I found the council quite enlightening. I've learned a lot. I know that Minister LeBlanc has, and our negotiator, Janice Charette, is there, as well as Mark Wiseman, Canada's ambassador to the United States. So I do think it's a all hands on deck effort. And I appreciate the hard work being done by the Prime Minister's team on trying to get the best deal possible for Canada.
Let me rope you in, Stephen, at this point, because I think there are two aspects to both the Advisory Council and also the point that Erin just mentioned, being able to talk about it. You've been in Geneva, you've been engaged in and advised on the negotiations with the United States. In ordinary times, things leak out of negotiations or out of positioning that could possibly have an impact on the flow of negotiations, but we don't expect any cataclysmic results out of leaks or out of things said a bit out of school. Whereas we know, at least whether it was the real reason or a pretext, that a simple ad quoting President Reagan could actually put to an end ongoing negotiations. So taking note of Erin's valuable point of being able to report back and get input, is there a danger also that communication of what goes on in the negotiations could have a negative impact on the flow of negotiations?
That's always a real risk, but I think that the benefits far outweigh the risks. I think right now, the Carney government has a lot of difficulty in these negotiations, in large part because the Canadian public is in no mood to engage with the Americans, and the business community and the labor unions really need some surety. They need some consistency. So they need an agreement. So I think messages coming out from this council that suggest these talks are difficult or this is where the talks are going are very important for the Canadian public to understand what is going on, and in a way, I don't mean to sound too crass, but in a way, soften up the Canadian public a little bit to understand that we need to make an agreement and concessions will need to be made. It's interesting, for example, that you say, well, a really good outcome would be the 232 tariffs somewhere in the single digits. A year ago, I think we would have thought that's an anathema, any tariffs at all, at any rate. It should be zero. And in fact, Prime Minister Carney has said that at one point. And so to me, I think it's very helpful. I think overall, it's more helpful. I do take your point that certain messages could come out that could be harmful because we don't know how Trump is going to react to certain things. He's very mercurial. But yeah, I think I'm glad that you're unleashed to talk about the challenges that Canada is facing. I think it's important for Canadians to hear that.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, I find it's as you said, there's always risks when you have a large group and you're talking about some sensitive manners that some of it will trickle out. But I think everyone is there for the best interests of the country, which is what I really like about it. And when it comes to the tariff piece, I think it's helpful for the Prime Minister and even Minister LeBlanc to have perspectives from outside of their caucus. One, if I could say, vindicating thing for me in being part of this is many of the things I was raising in the first Trump administration were being ignored then by, in my view, Prime Minister Trudeau and Minister Freeland, but are being taken up by the Carney government. Defense spending in the Arctic, those were issues that were live in the first Trump administration that we did not address, we did not take seriously. And that process also allowed me to really understand President Trump. I spent a lot of time, and I said this to Minister Freeland on one occasion, the most important part of this negotiation will be understanding the point of view and the mercurial, to use that term again, nature of the person we're negotiating with. President Trump, whether it was Japan 30 years ago or the Middle East, has talked about the use of tariffs. He's had an outdated, almost mercantilist view of trade that he then imposes his own winner versus loser binary question on for 30 years. And there's going to be no changing it with him. And I do think, Robert Lighthizer, who was USTR in the first administration, tried to focus it on the US-China geopolitical tension piece. And that's where the 232s were being used and could be justified under security grounds. But the president himself, left to his own devices, really views tariffs in two ways. One, we're going to dominate you. And two, he views them as a revenue source. And so many people thought that his Liberation Day approach was a secret way of basically creating a tax by allowing tariffs to be almost like his version of the GST, where he's going to have a revenue source, but not realizing the ripple effects. So I do think, to your point, that a lot of people thought, oh, we've got to just eliminate the tariffs. This is ridiculous. I've always said, with Trump's own proclivity related to tariffs, I think a win is probably just getting them down to a token amount on just a few parts of the economy, because he has a very long-standing view of tariffs that I think we're not going to change. So we'll see if we can get it down to that amount. Certainly the auto industry in the US is one of the strongest groups lobbying the White House with respect to the negative impact of tariffs. It's just a matter of time. Will this ever sink in with the president?
Let me perhaps challenge both of you on this a little bit. And you mentioned that, Erin, that two things you mentioned. First, we need to understand the president. And there I totally agree. And you also mentioned that the president has viewed tariffs in two ways, one of dominance and the other one as a revenue source going back 30 years. And there too, I agree with you entirely. And in fact, before the elections 2 years ago, when I was talking about the oncoming potential cataclysm for Canada, I was relying entirely on President Trump's stated objectives going back, as you said, 30 years, and also his experience in the first term. But here's where this is the point of challenge. I think, and this latest Truth Social on the smoke reiterated that his interview right after the finals with Prime Minister Carney standing right next to him reiterated that. And what we've heard Peter Navarro, his chief trade and economic advisor, say, I think President Trump genuinely believes that foreign governments pay the tariffs. We know that's what Peter Navarro genuinely believes. And Mr. Ladner, on more than one occasion, has said that. Whether he quite believes that or not is besides the point. That's the public posture. But I think President Trump genuinely believes that foreign governments pay the tariffs. And so whether as a question of dominance or revenue, the bigger issue is that the tariffs are coming out of the pockets of other countries. How do you make a deal with that? I mean, it's a single digit or double digit. I mean, that to me, that's the intellectual blockage.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do think there's that misunderstanding of who pays and not a recognition of the damage it's causing internally. Going back to the 232s from the first Trump administration, tariffs can have both a financial impact, but also a substitution effect. And I think that's how Lighthizer and Lighthizer's right hand was Jameson Greer, who's now the USTR. That's the way they viewed it, was that they viewed Chinese trade policy and transshipment as hollowing out the U.S. capabilities in shipbuilding and all these other areas, and the inability to have steel and special fabrication because everyone was just sending their work overseas to take advantage of the cheap Chinese. So by putting a high cost, it was like a barrier to stimulate a substitution and to provide new options in North America. But I don't think Trump ever looked at it that way. That's how I found the USTR kind of justified the geopolitical competition. And in fairness, the Obama administration started tariffing steel, Chinese steel, before Trump was elected. But I recommend to people to watch Trump's initial speech when he first ran for president. We all remember he descended the golden staircase, and people say, did the Simpsons predict this, all this sort. But within 45 seconds of speaking, so 45 seconds into Trump's political career, he starts talking about trade and tariffs and winning. We never win anymore. And I wrote about this in my Blue Skies podcast a year or so ago to really, and I even have a little GIF of the elevator in the Substack. You really have to view that speech. When everyone discounted him, he was actually kind of, mocked when he first presented in 2015. But if you actually see that message of losing and America will win again, actually played in the Rust Belt states to former Democrat, people that were kind of the casualties of globalization, and that hadn't been properly addressed through other public policy decisions of governments going back 40 years. So Trump captured a voter base that was increasingly disconnected from the traditional institutions, and his message is one that he firmly believes. And so I'm not sure we're going to be able to change his views on the tariffs, but I think we could maybe have him reduce or eliminate for other reasons. So if we can say we're partnering on shipbuilding, or we're partnering on the re-equipping of the U.S. military, I think these are ways we can cut around his narrative on trade.
Yeah, I think that's the good news on Trump's tariffs. Regardless of how he interprets them and who's paying, he definitely sees them as a negotiating tool. So I think the challenge for Canada is to try to create the conditions where it looks like, to your point, Erin, about win-loss. So it looks like a win for Trump and a loss for Canada, and he reduces the tariffs, and that is his negotiating stance. So that it doesn't suggest zero, but it does suggest perhaps a reduction. That's what he's done with other countries. It's what he's done with the UK. It's what he's done with the EU. And so there is some hope with respect to that. The other thing I would say, which I continue to find surprising, but this whole notion of CUSMA compliant goods is, quite frankly, rather surprising, given the cavalier fashion in which Trump ignores all other trade commitments. That one he continues to honor. So how we continue to define that going forward will be very useful. And I would imagine that the tariff discussion will be part of that, and whether we can expand the pie as to what qualifies as CUSMA compliant will be interesting to see.
I mean, that change came between February 1st and March 1st of 2025. And in fact, it was whether there's a causal relationship, but I'm sure there was an internal discussion, but also there was a swift reaction by the government within 2 days after the initial announcement of tariffs on February 1st to impose retaliatory tariffs, which I don't think anyone in Washington expected, frankly.
Let me speak to retaliatory tariffs for a minute. And this is another area. Yeah. This is another area where I feel Prime Minister Carney has vindicated my position from years earlier. You know, there's the great Plato or Aristotle talks about law being reason devoid of passion. I used to say to the Trudeau government that as much as it will feel good to bring in retaliatory tariffs, they will have an outsized impact on us and lose our ability to make case for integrated supply chains as we're negotiating a reduction of their tariffs. And what was really hard for me is when I was suggesting this, I was attacked relentlessly. And because I served in the military, I do consider myself a patriot. I still view myself as a veteran before anything else because I joined at 18 and I've done other things since then, but that's still how I see myself. So when I was being accused of capitulating to the Americans and all this stuff, it really upset me on a personal level. But this is where sometimes you have to forget the emotion and forget the political posturing and say, what's going to get us a resolution of this dispute? And until we get a resolution, how can we minimize the negative harm on our economy and on our workers? And the retaliatory stuff was an example of not smart policy, particularly when you see Trump. So it got to the point that I wrote an op-ed and I quoted the Getting to Yes Harvard negotiation method book that, all lawyers learn in law school, where the first rule of getting to yes is separate people from the problem. And they forgot that. When you've got Donald Trump, and you've got our prime minister at the time, who was the sort of leading progressive leader in the world, they were making it about themselves way too much when you needed to separate the people from the problem and say, short term, does the retaliatory make sense to us economically? The answer was no. And a lot of even union leaders and others would say this is probably not a prudent effort, but they wouldn't publicly criticize it because it looked like Canada standing up for Canada. And so this time, I think with the prime minister removed those and started to reestablish a much more serious approach on NAFTA, or on CUSMA and tariffs, I think it gave us a chance to have a better outcome than continuing to flaunt and to antagonize the president was never going to work.
But just on that, it's definitely consistent with this notion of elbows up. So I think there's, within the Canadian polity, there was certainly an understanding or a desire for retaliatory tariffs. It doesn't mean that it's a good idea, but there certainly was pressure, I would say, for that. I think the government as well thought that the threat of retaliatory tariffs had worked very well in the WTO labeling case. And so I think there was some thought that maybe this will work again. The other thing that I would say is what I find surprising, it's not a retaliatory tariff per se, but the delisting of U.S. wine and spirits has really gotten under the skin of the Americans. And now that's becoming a part of the negotiating mandate or part of the ask from the U.S., which is a bit ridiculous. It's actually, we're playing the U.S. game. The U.S. puts all kinds of things on their side of the scale and then says, well, we'll remove this if you do X, Y, or Z, which is exactly what Ontario, Quebec, and some other provinces have done. So it does work in some cases. I would also say, I mean, I take your point completely on retaliatory tariffs as an economic tool being not particularly useful. But who knows how the Trump administration is going to react to things? The Trump administrator, Trump himself's reaction to the Doug Ford TV ads was like, I don't think anyone really anticipated the ferocity of that reaction. I think the problem now, in my view anyway, with respect to retaliatory tariffs was I think the government of Canada needs to be careful that it doesn't look like it's unilaterally disarming in order to move negotiations along. And I think that it becomes less of an issue now that we're past the July 1st, quote unquote, deadline. But just lead me to a question that I do have, and that is, where do you think these are going? Like, how long are you going to be on this advisory panel? Like this, are we talking about, is there some sense that this is going to wrap up before the midterms? Are we talking this is going to be a long-term appointment? What are your thoughts on where this is going?
That's a great question. I don't think there's really been any discussion with the council or even when we were asked to participate on a timeline of it. And going back to your questions about the unpredictability of the president, I think we will serve at the pleasure or the displeasure of Canadians having to deal with uncertainty with our traditional trading partner and ally. I do think the council, I really love the ability, I left politics a little earlier than I probably first intended, courtesy of the Reform Act vote and the convoy and a whole range of things. But it allows me to contribute in a way that I think is productive and positive. And even post-Trump, I do think we're never going to put globalization back together in the way it was. I do think there is we're in a world where there's going to be a lot more new multilateral partnerships. The middle powers philosophy that Prime Minister talked about in Davos, I think that will be more common. I think there will be a need for a way that we can kickstart new relationships with the United States, regulatory harmonization in some areas, perhaps eliminating tariffs, partnerships on environmental issues. I've always said as Ontario builds out nuclear generation and Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador build out more hydro, can we decarbonize more of the American grid and make our electricity grid more resilient? So I do think there's probably ways that the council can serve more than just finalizing a deal with the U.S. president. And I do think with Prime Minister Carney, who has a private sector background, he's not afraid to get perspectives from the private sector or public sector operatives. I think I get a sense that the Prime Minister's team really values input as they make the final decisions. So who knows? I think a lot of us would love a deal quickly. I think there's one possible in the fall. And if we get a deal and we sort of at least normalize as much as possible, perhaps the council will be stood down, but I don't really know.
I would just say, as a trade policy along, having business voices is incredibly valuable and incredibly hard to find. Normally, you hear from business when there's a problem or there's an irritant, but you don't necessarily get the thoughtful advice from business that you would like in terms of how do we move forward. So I think there's a lot of merit for the council, and I think there's a lot of merit to keep the council going after CUSMA, because let's be serious, after this review, I don't imagine that we're going to extend it for 16 years after let's say we do have a deal in the fall. I don't think we'll get to the 16-year extension, which is a possibility, I suppose. But I think we're going to be into another review and another review. So I think you're in for a long-term position here, Erin, quite frankly.
I don't expect an announcement in respect of the CUSMA before the midterms. There may be some sort of an announcement of a deal before the midterms if, in fact, the administration considers it politically valuable, which I don't frankly think it will be. So
I think part of our need will be to make it politically valuable. And this is where, if you notice, I see the Prime Minister, even the new Consul General appointments that they're putting in the United States, there's a focus on key business sectors really leveraging. So we talked about beverage alcohol. You're right, it's an irritant. You hear about it all the time. I think the governor of Kentucky calls Doug Ford and other people weekly because Canadians drank a lot of bourbon. But if you look at the F-35 and other deals, there's a whole range of governors and states and closer races that if you start nailing down how a comprehensive deal of lower 232s, F-35, maybe some energy security agreement for refineries in Louisiana and Texas. And as you said, if Trump can frame it as we have won and Canada has lost, and we quietly know that certainty means that we won anyway, and a lower tariff amount means we won anyway. And if we want to be portrayed as losing, fine, if we can get a better deal than current. So I do think we have to cobble all of these sort of policy areas and key sectors together into a framework, which is why I was always pushing the security angle. And, look at critical minerals and uranium, for example. All of this is connected to an energy security, the energy transition, giving the U.S. preference for new critical mineral developments. That was talked about in the Biden administration under the Inflation Reduction Act. You can tie that all up. Will it be enough to satisfy the president? Unsure. I tell everyone when they ask me about the situation in the U.S., and I say there's really two negotiation tables. There's Janice Charette and Jameson Greer, the formal tables for both the CUSMA review and wider trade issues. And then there's the executive table. Everyone knows that any final agreement, even a temporary one on 232s, will have to go by the president. And one thing I think Prime Minister Carney has done effectively has established a respectful dialogue with the president that has its ebbs and flows. I'm sure Prime Minister Carney doesn't like waking up to the latest Truth Social posts, but he's established a professional dialogue. And I think that means Canada will be ready to strike the executive deal if the moment appears. And the fleeting moment of getting Trump in a moment of reasonableness, I'm willing to make a deal with Canada, might be fleeting, but I think we're at least ready. And then the other table, our counsel and other voices in Canada contribute to Janice's mission. So I do have to say, of course, I'm biased. I'm part of the council and I really want to see Canada succeed. But I do see a very smart strategy at play, including with the new consul general positions. Like they seem to be really making sure that when that moment comes for a deal, we strike.
Well, on that positive note, I'm mindful of the time. There's, of course, a whole lot more we can talk about, and I'm hoping, Erin, I'm going to be calling on you for another session. This time, taking advantage of you and Stephen's past life as ambassador to Poland to talk about security, the impact of security considerations on not just on Canada-U.S. relations, but on Canada's global trade and economic security and prosperity. So thank you so much for today. We'll be back to talk trade and security in due course.
Great. I look forward to the next discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.